I wanted to talk about the principle of suspicion and just apply this to the Lucy Letby case. So the principle of suspicion is animated by an internal kind of personal conviction that your suspicion is correct. And because it's correct, you can proceed and act on that basis. Now, when people with power hold to this principle, then becoming a suspect is enough for you to then be punished. Once you've been identified, essentially your fate is sealed. Now that principle, the principle of suspicion, it's irrational with respect to basing actions on evidence, but it is an effective way of projecting domineering power. And so it strikes fear or even terror into people, and that's useful for getting compliance. And the principle of suspicion can also make for very persuasive sophistry because it appeals to very common ways of thinking. You know, we all tend to think that our suspicions are correct and so on. So there's an appeal behind this principle as well. And so I take the principle of suspicion from Hegel, and Hegel identifies three eras when the principle of suspicion is the kind of the defining principle of the era. So he talks about the period of Rome under the emperors. He talks about the witch hunt mania in the 16th and 17th century. And he has a briefer period as well, the period of the terror in the French Revolution. Now, reading Hegel seems to be optimistic and thinks, well, we've kind of gone beyond operating on this principle now. But unfortunately, of course, the principle of suspicion is not a thing of the past. It's something that we still have to engage with. And so let's see how the principle of suspicion operates in practice. There's two ways it operates. You either go straight from suspicion to punishment, or you have suspicion and then trial and punishment. So suspicion and punishment is very simple. Go back to the Roman emperors. You know, if the Praetorian Guard are out to get you, they get you, essentially. There's no intermediate stage. If you're a boat in the Gulf of Mexico and the American government are out to get you, they get you. You know, again, it's just suspicion straight to punishment. But then there's the three-step process, has the intermediate trial. I mean, if you say a trial, well, then you might seem that isn't a principle of suspicion, because, of course, in a trial, these suspicions are tested, and that, of course, is correct. So in a rational trial, suspicions are indeed tested against the evidence. However, there are also irrational trials in which suspicions are simply fitted to the evidence. I then think that there are what we can call hybrid trials, where there is an element of rationality in the trial, and rationality and the principle of suspicion are in conflict. So, as in many other witch hunt trials, Miss Letby's trials, I think, were hybrid ones, where the prosecution was based on the principle of suspicion and the defense was based on rationality. Let me then move on to Lucy Letby's case. So the foundation of the case against Lucy Letby, I think, was one of pure suspicion. And the form it took was one of turning an unknown into a kind of a known inner certainty. So it started out, if you think about the doctors, they think, we do not know why the babies collapsed or died. We only know why they didn't, and therefore we know that Lucy Letby did it. And I think that was the essential way in which they thought. I think that encapsulates it reasonably well. And to justify the transition then from not knowing how these babies died or collapsed to knowing, the persecutors of Miss Letby created so-called evidence to fit the suspicion, and then refused or only pretended to test the evidence that they'd concocted. This was the evidence then that got Miss Letby convicted, and she then went to the Court of Appeal with her plea to try and be able to appeal. So let's move on then to the Court of Appeal and look at what the judges did. So the Court of Appeal judgment rejecting Miss Letby's plea to be allowed to appeal was thoroughly irrational, I think. And we can ask, in penning this judgment, were Dame Victoria Sharp and Lord Justice Holroyd and Mrs. Justice Lambert, DBE, were they animated by the principle of suspicion? I'm not sure. The idea that these judges might have been so biased is a terrible prospect. But the principle of suspicion at least involves an element of sincerity and alternative explanations of the conduct of these judges, such as sort of treating the case as some kind of game or something like that. I think alternative explanations are perhaps even worse. Anyway, whatever the state of their inner consciousness of these judges, the Court of Appeal not only endorsed the irrational arguments of the prosecution, but they added more irrational arguments of their own. So to show this, I'm going to critically examine how the judges responded to the defence submission that with respect to intravenous injection of air to cause air embolism, there was no case to answer. That's one of the things the defence said when they wanted to appeal. And that submission, of course, was correct. This business about intravenous injection of air was founded entirely on suspicion. There wasn't ever any evidence. But the judges said no, there was a strong prosecution case for intravenous air injection. And they argued this by fitting the expert evidence of both Professor Owen Arthur and Dr. Darry Evans to the suspicions against Miss Letby, and also manipulating the evidence that the defence had put forward, the evidence of Professor Shu Lee, to make this evidence appear to be, quote, irrelevant. I'll turn to Dr. Evans's first and look at what the Court of Appeal said. So the Court of Appeal presented what they said was a hypothetical account of expert witnesses' reasoning that Miss Letby made intravenous air injections based only on suspicion. And you can see it there on the right-hand side of the screen. So the Court of Appeal said if any witness had given evidence to the effect that he or she could not identify any other possible cause of the baby's collapse and therefore assumed on that basis alone that the baby's collapse must have been due to an air embolus, that evidence might well be criticised as mere conjecture. And that isn't, in fact, a hypothetical account. It's exactly how the expert witnesses reasoned, and we can compare it with Dr. Evans when he was interviewed by Dr. Raj Prasad on intravenous air injection shortly after the trial. And Dr. Evans identifies, as you can see, cases where your diagnosis is made by ruling out other factors, and you end up with the diagnosis where this is the only explanation. You've ruled everything out. What's left is the diagnosis. However, we should add that Dr. Evans said that sometimes you had what he called a full house of evidence of air embolism. And that included evidence of coming from the X-rays, and it included evidence with regard to skin discoloration. And the Court of Appeal made a similar claim. And by dropping Dr. Evans's observation that you only sometimes have a full house, it justified its description of mere conjecture as being merely hypothetical. So according to the Court of Appeal, the suspicion that Miss Letby made intravenous injections are always supported by a full house of evidence, although their preferred metaphor was a constellation of factors, with its kind of the suggestion that there were kind of countless pieces of evidence then. So we want to then look at how this mere conjecture, that the Court of Appeal, using the Court of Appeal's term, then was turned into a constellation of factors, and two of the ways in which this is done was by having the images of gas observed in X-rays of some of the babies being said to form a basis for a diagnosis of air embolus. Again, that's a direct quote from the Court of Appeal. And second, their argument that the skin discoloration seen on the babies was said to be consistent with air embolism. So I'll turn first to the X-rays. This is where the Court of Appeal supported a pseudo-test that was conducted by Professor Arthur. So Professor Arthur's a consultant radiologist at Great Ormond Street Hospital and a witness for the prosecution, conducted research in preparation for Miss Letby's trial. And his findings supported the defence, but he twisted them to support the prosecution. And instead of criticising this twisting of the evidence, the Court of Appeal reinforced it. let me go on to Professor Arthur's, what I call Professor Arthur's real test. So Professor Arthur did I think, actually a very helpful and genuine test. He looked at the pertinent X-rays of at least 7 of the babies where Lucy Letby was alleged to have attacked them by means of intravenous injection of air. So he looked at least 7 of these babies, or the X-ray images of at least 7 of these babies. And in imaging of 3 of the babies, he could see gas in the great vessels, meaning the blood vessels around the heart. What Professor Arthurs then did is he reviewed the X-rays of 500 babies who had died at Great Ormond Street Hospital, and where there was no suspicion of intravenous air injection. And he did this, as the Court of Appeal judges put it, to satisfy himself that seeing gas was unusual. As it would be, for example, if imagine if he'd looked at the 500 cases and he'd only seen in 1 or 2 occasions that there was imaging of gas in the great vessels. So if it was only 1 or 2 times out of 500, then certainly that would be unusual. But in fact, Professor Arthur's assumption was refuted, because far from being unusual, he saw gas in the great vessels in about a quarter of the cases, in about 125 cases out of 500. So he saw it about a quarter of the time. So if gas can be seen in the great vessels about a quarter of the time, about 125 times out of 500, when intravenous injection is not suspected, then is seeing gas 3 times out of 7, is that unusual? Is that suspicious? Obviously the answer is no, it isn't. So, as I say, with this review of 500 babies, I think Professor Arthurs had conducted a real test, and one that showed the jurors, who perhaps, contrary to their intuition, that seeing gas in the great vessels is commonplace, and it wasn't a suspicious society at all. And what do the judges say about this? They say nothing. They're completely silent on the implications of this finding, and then they undertake what philosophers of science call a degenerative problems shift, and they try again with 38 of the youngest babies and find that 8 of them show gas. Is that significantly different from 125 out of 500, or indeed 3 out of 7? No, it's not. At this point, Professor Arthurs and the Court of Appeal judges run a pseudo test. It's a kind of a ruse. They take these 8 of the youngest babies where gas has been found, and they don't ask, is this unusual? We know that it's not. They ask instead, is it unusual for these 8 cases to have been unexplained? And then Arthur says, well, all of these cases at Great Ormond Street, we explained all of them. We knew why these babies had died. So it was indeed unusual for them to be unexplained. And it was that unusualness that was then used by the prosecution to say, well, what's going on in these 3 cases where Lucy Letby was said to be involved? Now, there is some inconvenient facts, in a sense, for what Arthur has done when he's gone down to this test of 8 babies. And the first thing, which I find strange, is that on the face of things, at least even amongst these 8 babies at Great Ormond Street, at least one of these deaths, and perhaps several of them, was unexplained because it was classified as sudden unexpected death in infancy. So that's a classification of death for sure, but it's not an explanation, is it? And so it's a bit odd to say that none of these 8 cases were unexplained, but still that's just what we said. And then another inconvenient fact is that, and we've already heard about the post-mortem reports, and so 2 of these Countess of Chester babies, they had post-mortem reports that identified the cause of death as being a result of natural causes. And again, that's ignored, and they just say, well, it's all unexplained, it's unusual, it's suspicious. It is a basis for diagnosis of air embolus, but it's not a rational basis, is it? So we've got these problems, we've got the fact that there is a sudden unexpected death in infancy, we've got a difficulty in that it is not comparing like with like. So if the doctors at the Countess of Chester Hospital insist on saying they do not know how babies died, and if they reject post-mortem findings that say that these babies died from natural causes, then of course the deaths by their account are going to be unexplained. You can't then draw a comparison with doctors at another hospital who do not hold this kind of suspicious attitude and have accepted post-mortem explanations of deaths of 8 babies. You're just not comparing you can't draw any kind of comparative conclusion from that. There's also no comparative data on the babies where gas is not observed. So in fact, no figures at all are given for any of the other 492 babies in the original test. I mean, we just don't know about how many of their deaths were explained or unexplained. But however, we can assume, I think, that unexplained deaths are also going to have been unusual amongst these babies, including the approximately 375 babies who didn't have gas observed in the vessels around the heart. And if we assume that they also had deaths that were by and large explained, all that Professor Arthur has shown is this. First, he's shown that baby deaths or collapses at Countess of Chester Hospital in cases where this Letby stands accused are unexplained in the eyes of the doctors there. And he's shown then second that it's unusual for baby deaths at Great Ormond Street Hospital to be unexplained. That's all he's shown. That's it. Let's move on to skin discoloration and making Professor Lee's evidence sound irrelevant. The defense had tried to introduce the evidence of Professor Lee, who argued that the skin discolorations observed on the babies were not consistent with what was known of intravenous air embolism in the medical literature. And the judges said that Dr. Lee's evidence came too late. However, although they refused formally to consider the evidence, they preserved the appearance of fairness by seeming to test Dr. Lee's evidence anyway and finding it. I say they found it irrelevant. So the Court of Appeal said that Dr. Lee had missed the point. He was insisting that only one specific form of skin discoloration is sufficient to diagnose air embolism. But they said that, that the kind of the localized transient skin discolorations that were so often seen in these babies, that was consistent with air embolism. That's what Dr. Lee had found in his own report, they said, and that was all that mattered. Well, of course, it was, in fact, the judges who had missed the point when Professor Lee reviewed the medical literature. He found there are no reported cases of localized transient skin discoloration in cases where air has been accidentally injected into the veins. The judges discussed Dr. Lee's so-called irrelevant evidence over 24 paragraphs in their judgment, but they didn't mention that finding. They weren't really testing Dr. Lee's evidence at all. They were fitting it to the prosecution case by selectively citing and omitting things to make it appear that Dr. Lee was arguing one thing, when in fact he was arguing something quite different. The Court of Appeal had another argument against Dr. Lee, and it was that even if he did have a point, it was still irrelevant, as the evidence as a whole showed that Miss Letby killed or attacked babies in one way or another. And if the prosecution was wrong about intravenous injection or anything else, this meant only that she killed or attacked the babies by some other method. So if we remind ourselves about the original suspicion of the Countess of Chester Hospital doctors, it was, we do not know why the babies collapsed or died, only why they didn't, therefore we do know Lucy Letby did it. Well, when they dismissed Dr. Lee's evidence, the Court of Appeal draws out, I think, what this suspicion really means. The suspicion really means Lucy Letby did it, and it doesn't matter how. That kind of approach, that suspicious approach, is one that is unfalsifiable. The argument that Miss Letby is guilty because of the whole thing makes it impossible ever to acquit Miss Letby because any kind of supposed evidence could be fitted to a suspicion. None of the evidence which has been made up to convict Miss Letby, none of it can withstand testing. It all comes down to cherry picking or something along those lines. It's all meaningless. But for the very reason that it's meaningless, they can always come up with more. It is literally infinite. The amount of evidence that Miss Letby's persecutors can bring to bear against her has no limit. And we've seen that again at the Thirlwell inquiry. There's about 40% of tubes dislodged and so on. So in this way, the suspicion that has got Miss Letby in prison for life has become totally unassailable. Unless you can actually prove that it's impossible for Miss Letby to have carried out the attacks, it cannot be falsified. Whatever evidence is shown to be wrong, there is a ready answer. It doesn't matter, she's guilty, it's the whole thing. Thank you.